There you
All
go.
right, great. I'd like to welcome everyone today to our School Board U webinar on school construction, supporting equitable access to high quality educational opportunities.
So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you again for joining us. As Carrie said, my name is Debbie Singizer, and I have the pleasure of moderating today's webinar. I am the Director of Board Services at the Vermont School Boards Association. We have an amazing panel that's lined up for you today to address the different aspects of school construction and how you as school board members can make a difference. So this is our agenda for the next hour. And part of the introduction to our topic today, I'd like to begin with a timeline of school construction in Vermont and take a look at what has been happening in this arena over the last almost 20 years. So what you're looking at is a very, very general outline or timeline of what's been happening in terms of school construction in Vermont going back to the year 2007, when Vermont ended its school construction program. Not surprisingly, deferred facilities maintenance has increased significantly since 2007, when the moratorium on state construction aid to schools began. In 2022, there was a statewide school facilities assessment that was conducted, and it estimated that Vermont schools will need more than $6.3 billion just to fund in-kind replacements in the next 21 years. But please note that many think that this is a conservative estimate and that in fact it will take much more money than the $6.3 billion. In 2023, a task force was created through legislation with the mandate to consider funding options for a statewide school construction program, how such a program would be governed, and how it would be funded. This task force wrote and issued a report on how Vermont should address these billions of dollars in school construction needs and delivered the report to the legislature in February of this year. The report is linked here on the slide, and you will have access to the slide when we send out an email at the end of the webinar, which will include this presentation. Unfortunately, this important report was quickly overshadowed by the buildup to town meeting day and the ensuing record failure of 30 plus school budgets, and it really didn't get the attention that it deserved. So given the urgent nature of deferred maintenance and the aging school buildings, as well as recent initiatives at the state level to address these challenges, the VSBA wanted to bring attention and focus back to this very important issue. So that was the genesis of this webinar today, and why we, the VSBA, decided to change this webinar from one that was supposed to focus on more on summer maintenance projects to the one that we're having today. We are delighted to offer you this opportunity to hear firsthand from those who have been on the front lines of school construction in Vermont in different capacities. You will hear from individuals who served on the task force, those who researched and wrote the report, as well as a project manager who has worked on school construction projects in Vermont. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and bring the pan. Hi. Hi, Jill. I would like to introduce our panelists in the order that they will be appearing. First up, we will have Jill Briggs Campbell and Bob Donahue from the Vermont Agency of Education. Jill is Director of Operations, and Bob is School Facilities Program Manager at the agency. Jill and Bob will speak about the school facilities study and report, highlighting the key findings and recommendations, as well as the tools that the agency is building to aid schools with their capital planning in the future. Then we will hear from Jeff Francis, the Executive Director of the Vermont Superintendents Association, who will speak briefly to the proposed legislation in response to the report, specifically H871, that is currently under consideration. Jeff will also tell us how school board members can advocate for school construction in their districts. And then to round out our discussion today, we have Marty Spalding with us from Capital Project Consulting, who will speak about school facilities projects and how to start one, focusing specifically on the board's role and what actions are required of the board. So Jill and Bob from the agency will start us off. However, before I hand it over to them, I'd like to begin with a very brief poll. It's a 2-question poll for you. And the reason we're doing this poll is it'll give our presenters a better sense of your knowledge about the statewide facilities assessment, and also how many of you are from districts that actually put out a bond vote for capital improvement in recent years. So Carrie just put up the poll for you, and we'll just take a minute to have you complete this. Actually, there's 2 questions up there right now. Perfect.
And Debbie, while folks are completing that,
Yeah.
Bob is going to be sharing screen. So I just want to preface that it's a live link, so we couldn't send it to you ahead of time. So just so that he has sharing permissions.
He does. Yep. We took care of that right before. Yep.
Awesome.
Perfect. Thanks, Jill. That's for the dashboard. We're excited to see that.
Yeah.
He will. He will.
Thank you, Carrie.
Yes.
I feel like I should cue the Jeopardy music right now.
So, Debbie, when you're done sharing, just let me know and I'll make him a co-host then.
Okay. I'm done sharing.
Okay, I can do that now.
I won't be sharing again, I don't think, until we get to Marty. So that's fine. It looks like we've got 29 of 29 responses. So
100%.
I'm going to end the poll and look at these results. Oh, actually, you're doing it, Carrie. Thank you.
Yes, sorry.
That's fine.
There you go.
So how familiar are you with the statewide facilities assessment conducted by the AOE? 21% are very. Actually, it looks like the majority are right in the middle. 62% are somewhat familiar with it. They've read about it. Some have heard about it. That's good. That's really good. And then 17% haven't heard anything at all. But at least there's some general familiarity with it. That's great. And if your district put out a bond vote for capital improvements in the past 5 years, did it pass? The answer is 4 passed out of 16, so that's 25%, and then 12 out of 16, 75% did not pass. Very interesting. Okay. I will stop. Whoop. Are you doing that, Carrie? Yeah.
Yeah, sorry.
That's okay. Can you close the poll?
I did.
There we go. Perfect. So now, without further ado, I will hand it over to Jill and Bob.
All right. I will be very, very brief because I want to let Bob do most of the talking, and we've got some really very cool, frankly, tools to share with you. So Jill Briggs Campbell, AOE Director of Operations. Our operations team supports school districts in many, many different things: emergency operations, school safety and security, but also importantly, school facilities and hopefully a future state construction program. Bob Donahue is our very first ever AOE School Facilities Program Manager. Almost at his 1-year anniversary, and has really taken over the work of the facilities assessment, which we will be discussing here. That work wrapped up in October, and then we've had sort of a correction period where facilities managers have been able to review the reports. If there was a need to make any updates, we've been working on that. And now we're sort of into the next phase of work. As I've said in several different public venues and testimony, that statewide facilities assessment is really step 1. Before we completed that, we've never had a statewide database, sort of a statewide understanding of the condition of our facilities. Now we have that data, and now we're in the so what? What do we do with this? How do we use this information? And that's really the work that Bob is engaged in, and he's in really close contact with business managers, school facilities folks like Marty and other experts in the field have been really instrumental in helping us figure out how we can make this data useful for you all as you are making critical decisions around sort of the future of your school buildings and how you can invest in them most effectively, both from a cost effectiveness, but also really pointing towards, how do we maintain and operate school buildings that will best serve our students. So that's always kind of our lodestone that we're pointing to. So with no further ado, I will stop talking and allow Bob to share the work that we're doing.
Sure. Okay. Thanks, Jill. And hello to everybody. As Jill said, I joined about 11 months ago, and just the facilities assessment work out in the field was well underway and getting going. And Marty and his team are going out and collecting data and supporting BVTA in their actual field work of doing the assessments in the schools. And the compilation of all the data ended up in generating reports for all the school districts for each of their school buildings. And some of you apparently have seen some of those reports, or at least heard of those reports. And I think it's good to kind of frame out what the reports are and what the reports are not, because there has been, varied discussion levels about some of the inaccuracies that are associated with the reports. And some people don't think that they went deep enough. Others think that they're very grateful that we even had anybody going out to the school to take a look at it. So there's a bell curve of people's impressions of what those reports are. But basically, it was a high-level assessment done for all the schools across the state. And they took a look at the major systems that are comprised of school system, from the building envelope, the building facade, look at the grounds, and also all of the major system components within the building itself. And then what the facilities assessors did was, based upon feedback from local facilities staff, and absent that, taking a look at name tags on the equipment, and then coming up what they thought was the remaining useful life of every asset that was identified in the facilities assessment. And what they would then come up with is, given what is basically there's industry standards of what certain horsepower boilers cost, what certain costs are associated with different size air handlers and the like. And they came up with an estimated cost for all the assets they identified. And then, based upon their remaining useful life, they predicted in what calendar year these assets would be replaced. And so over the next 20 years, they have forecasted what would be the annual expenditures to replace all of the assets that were identified. So this all sounds good and wonderful, and we capture all the assets that exist in the building, which is great from the perspective of going forward and managing those assets. But what we need to understand is that the costs associated with anything that's been identified in these facilities assessments is a replacement in kind costs. And there are costs associated with any of the work that's associated with any of the findings, that those costs have not been captured because they just can't be known at the time that you do the assessment. So it may say that you replace a boiler, you replace a roof, you replace a whole wall of windows, and none of the costs that are associated with doing any of the permitting, any of the engineering or design work that may have to happen with the change of that equipment, none of those costs are there. If we had a very antiquated control system, you wouldn't be replacing it with an antiquated control system. You would be upgrading it to the latest state-of-the-art kind of controls. And those costs would probably be more than what that old system would cost. So even though we have quantified the cost through all of this facilities assessment work, there are additional costs that should be expected and will be incurred in doing any of the work that would be undertaking, addressing any of the needs identified. So this gives the state a across the board comparison, mostly of building to building, and the absolute dollar values identified are not representative of the true costs that would end up being incurred when everything is addressed. But it is a great way to look at a portfolio of buildings, and with the same assessment scrutiny applied to each of the buildings, it now gives us a way of comparing across that whole portfolio which buildings are most in need from a relative perspective, not necessarily from the absolute dollar perspective. And I think that's the thing we always have to keep in mind. It's giving us an idea of the deficiencies. It is giving us a rough idea of the cost if we were to replace everything as it was, but the costs are going to be larger than what's been identified. What those costs are really come down to what is the actual design solution that's implemented at the time these pieces of equipment are changed out. So everybody got a report for their schools, and it gives them an idea then of all of these findings. What Jill referenced earlier in her opening remarks is this is the first step, and the exciting thing going forward is something I'm going to be sharing with you shortly here. All the data that resides in this database, instead of it just residing as a PDF report that each district has, this data is now going to be accessible to every school district and to the public for looking at the schools across the state. So it is a very transparent way of everybody seeing all the same data. The interpretation of the data is going to be important, and jumping to conclusions about it could easily be done. But I think in the framework of understanding any of the notes that are associated with the dashboard, it's really going to help people come to understanding and being informed in order to go to school board meetings and meetings about potential construction projects, and they'll have so much more information to work with. It's also going to become a working document such that facilities managers and business managers will be able to periodically do updates to the database as they change out capital equipment and perform their maintenance work. And we can start actually keeping track of all the work that's getting done, see all the assets that are getting replaced, and then every year it updates what the expenditures would be forecasted into the future, so that now it's a rolling capital project plan almost in place for everybody to see. Not nearly near the perfection that we would want, but it's a huge leap from where we've been. And I think it's going in the right direction. So I know we have pressed for time, so I don't want to talk too long about it because we could spend the whole hour just talking about this. But what I'm going to do is share the screen. And when you all tell me that you can see the screen, let me know. I'm hoping that you see a screen.
We've got it, Bob. Looking good.
Okay, all right. So this is going to be a dashboard that probably, I would say within, I'm hoping no more than 2 months, Jill, we would have this dashboard actually live on the AOE website. And this is going to be a graphical presentation of all of the information that was generated through the facilities assessment work. And Jill and I had an opportunity to preview this just yesterday afternoon with BVTA because they only just finished it up. So what you're seeing here still needs some tweaks to it, but it's the overall framework of what is going to become a publicly accessible dashboard, looking at all the information that the AOE collected through the facility assessment. So it's taking all the schools and school districts and plotting them out on overlaying all the information about the school districts on a GIS map of the state of Vermont. And it's wonderful in that you can drill down to individual school levels, individual school building levels, gathering all the information that we have in the database regarding each school. So if I wanted to take a look on any particular school, I can click on it, and it actually brings up what district it's part of. If it was part of a campus report, which is basically when BVTA went out, if there were multiple buildings and maybe different school levels, elementary and middle, on the same common acreage, they would have a campus report that incorporated the multiple buildings into one report. But then it's a real quick snapshot to take a look at what are the 20-year renewable costs for this particular building. And then it starts breaking it down into different metrics that we could look at it. We could look at it cost per square foot, cost per student. And there's these different metrics that we're still working on the final determination of which ones we want as part of the dashboard. But nevertheless, it gives you a feel for how quickly you can drill down into each individual school's information. And then as we go to the bottom of the screen, there are these different tabs along the bottom, which are the key indicator tabs. And before this meeting, I was taking a look at Addison Central just because I'm part of Addison Central School District. And so the data might be more meaningful to me. And it's just a way that I'm using to kind of check how great is this data. And so this quickly brings up a relative comparison chart of the renewal cost by square foot by school. And then you can take a look at the different plan types, and we'd have to spend a lot more time than is allocated to this meeting to go in what do the different plan types of accessibility life cycle renewal, performance and integrity, and safety. Some of them seem intuitively obvious what they are. Others, you might just need a little ferreting out of what are the specific nuances of each term. And we're looking at having all this information as a real quick snapshot way of people to take a look at their particular schools. And then if they choose to do, they can actually do comparisons of one school against the state average or multiple schools against the state average. And so it's a great way to kind of benchmark where you are in comparison to fellow schools in across the state. As always, we want the information to be transportable. So all of this information is exportable to an Excel spreadsheet for anybody to export and then have at their fingertips to review in the comfort of wherever they want to review it, instead of having to be, tied into doing it on a computer. So in a nutshell, this is everything that was done in the field, and all the reports that were issued is now going to be at the fingertips whoever wants to go to the AOE website and start digging in as deep as they wish to go. And in the ensuing months that come, once this works, there's going to be another set of improvements to the dashboard that facilities managers and business managers and perhaps superintendents will have access to those. And then the AOE will be the gatekeeper of kind of the information that needs to get updated, how we interface that with BVTA and their asset calc database. Those details are still on the concept board of how we're going to make that all work. But anytime that data does get updated, it's going to be like within the next day, it'll be live change data for everybody. So I could go on, and I know I have to be respectful of other presenters' time. So I'm going to end it there, but I appreciate you letting me be able to do that.
And Debbie, I did pop in the chat that once this goes live, Bob and I would be thrilled, obviously, to come back and provide a tutorial to folks about how you can navigate your way through, how you all as school board members can think about using these tools to do planning, but also communication, with your school communities and with your towns as you're, trying to put things up to bond and, thinking about what you're investing in and budgets and that sort of thing. So very, very happy to come back and share more information once this goes live.
Great. Which you said will be in about 2 months, you believe? Okay.
We're
so
going
I
to
think
think ish, Debbie, ish.
Okay.
We're heading towards that.
Right. That's our goal.
That's your goal. Okay.
Yeah.
That's good to know. Thank you very much, Bob. That looks so exciting. That's fairly, it looks like there's limitless possibilities on how to use this dashboard. It's really helpful. Thank you so much.
Oh yeah, you're right.
I'm gonna actually first, could you stop sharing your screen so we can go back to the full panel?
Yeah, I was trying to look intelligent and figure out how to do that without having to ask for help. But so let's see. Trying to see, I don't see where it says stop sharing, and that's the problem.
It should be a red button that just says stop sharing.
Yeah, the thing is, my whole screen went to the small, all of us are in a small.
Can Carrie seize back control? That usually works.
Yeah, Carrie, do you think you can do that?
Trying to figure out how to do that. Thanks. I'm figuring it out right now, trying to figure that out.
That's okay.
Sorry.
Well, Carrie's
about
figuring that out. And she will figure it out because she figures everything out. I'll hand it over to Jeff Francis at the Vermont Superintendents Association. Oh, she did it. See, I told you she could do it.
There you go.
Thanks.
Thank you, everyone. I am Jeff Francis. I'm the Executive Director for the School Superintendents Association. I want to start with a couple of acknowledgments. First, it really is an honor to be sandwiched between experts on this panel. And I don't say these words lightly. Jill Briggs-Campbell and Bob Donahue have been like the fertilizer on the tree that is the restoration of the school construction aid program. You've all heard the old adage, when's the best time to plant a tree, 40 years ago or yesterday? Well, the effort to reestablish school construction aid in Vermont really started back in around 2020, when the House Education Committee, under the leadership of Representative Kate Webb from Shelburne, really began an appreciation for the fact that school construction aid had been suspended in 2007, and there were dramatic needs that we're now so well aware of. There was a representative who's still an active member, John Arison, from the Windsor area, who took a real interest. So I was very involved myself. We first went to the institutions committee, which handles all the capital construction matters for the state, both practically and from a policy standpoint, and couldn't get much attention because the treasurer at the time had a real eye on bonded indebtedness from the state and didn't know that there was an avenue that might get us back on the path of restoration. So the lion's share of the work happened in the House Education Committee. There were a bunch of people involved, including myself, Dave Epstein from Truex Cullen, so on and so forth. Marty was a participant in that. And it all started or was restarted with Act 72, which set a very useful framework to get this work started again. And we were moving along at a pretty good pace. But when Jill showed up and then Bob, they really have been extraordinary leaders in terms of the quantity of work that has been done, including support for the School Construction Aid Task Force. So we are at a point now where we're not ready to restart the School Construction Aid program, but we are a lot further along than I would have hoped, given the pace of how public policy works in general, but also in the state of Vermont. So Jill and Bob, thank you so very much for the work that you have done. As Debbie talked about, the School Construction Aid Task Force was an entity that was also created by legislation that had broad membership, and it was intended to even further the work more. And that task force, which I was a member of, did good work and didn't complete the work, though. So the result of the failure to, or the inability to complete the work really manifested itself under the leadership of Representative Peter Conlon from Middlebury, who's also been a real all-star in terms of keeping this work going, in H871. So now we're left in this legislative session with a bill titled H871 that is intended to push this work along even further. And I'm going to give a real high overview of that bill. And Jill, I'd invite you to comment, because a lot of the work in the bill was reflective of input that came from Jill and Bob specifically, but also Jill's counterpart or near counterpart in the treasurer's office. So Mike Pichek, who's a new treasurer than we had in 2020, has really been a huge supporter of trying to make sure we get back on track with regard to school facilities. H871 does a few things, and if I miss the specifics of it, Jill, I'd invite you to comment. The first thing that it envisions is a facilities master plan grant program where school districts could get grant awards from the Agency of Education, the purpose of which is to really fund and fuel the substantive work that would be necessary in order to get, I would say, the mindset, community engagement, and also a focus on facilities needs in the district in order to move toward a modern education infrastructure, let's say. The agency is working on criteria. It will be a master plan product that is just what you would envision, and maybe some of you have experienced. These master plans will include a description of the educational mission, vision, and goals of the supervisory union, a description of the educational programs and services offered by the SU, performance of a space utilization assessment, identification of new program needs, enrollment projections, facilities assessment, probably advanced, and then information regarding the various design options that could be explored. So it's really intended to support districts in being ready to actually start the school construction process. The AOE will work on the criteria for awards, I think, and Jill will correct me if it's not true. It's going to be a competitive program with funding going to places that have the most well-established need and demonstrate readiness. But it's a 5-year initiative to really keep the districts moving with regard to these school facilities master plans. So that's one piece of it. The legislation also calls for a pre-qualified list of architecture and engineering consultants, because the expectation is as this work expands, and we hope it does, that you're going to need that kind of technical assistance and expertise. So there's a goal to get that pre-qualification list in place so that people can turn to it without having to, for example, go searching for a consultant. Very significantly, it establishes a state aid for school construction working group, which importantly is comprised of 6 legislators and the Secretary of Education. And the reason for that is they want it to be an action-focused entity that returns to the next legislative session with a plan for further legislation to push things along. And that group is going to work on not only a recommended plan for a statewide school construction aid program, including recommendations on implementation, but they're also going to look at potential governance models for an entity that is going to specialize in supporting schools and school construction aid. Jill did a lot of research on that. The things that I'm talking about, she has a deeper knowledge of than I do. But I participated in the testimony on the legislation and know what it says. And it really is intended to be lean and keep things moving in the right direction. It's important to note that this working group that will be comprised of legislators and the secretary are going to look at prioritization criteria under which school construction aid dollars will ultimately be provided. And the things that they're looking at as eligibility criteria were a product of the school facilities work group that I was a member of, but it just the General Assembly enumerates the things that this working group should focus on, and I'll run through these briefly. One is that school districts have been appropriately maintaining and operating their own buildings at the supervisory union or school district level. You're going to need to have a 5-year capital plan, thus the importance of that grant program, but also for folks that have the capacity to do it without a grant to turn headlong into that. You need to have a facility condition index maximal level, and Bob spoke about that would preclude eligibility, but may qualify a building for a state share percentage bonus to replace the building. That's technical language. It also says that the master plan should consider adaptive reuse of schools for housing or other social infrastructure. So it's not a given that that would be a requirement, but presumably you would have to look at it. And then something that I actually supported and spoke about at the on the task force that I was on was they're going to take a look at whether or not a community, in order to be eligible for school construction aid, cannot, meaning they cannot have have exclusionary zoning regulations that would preclude lesser resource families from living in an applicable school district. And the notion there really is an extension on the fact that we're trying to attract people to Vermont. We're hoping to have diverse and equity in our communities. So this group will look at whether exclusionary zoning is a disqualifier for state aid to school construction. Small point, but an important point. The group is also going to look at how the money would get allocated, and I think very significantly what incentives should be to qualify, but also they'll work with the treasurer to sort of kickstart the overall funding mechanism. And something that I am not all that informed on today, but Jill or Bob may want to speak to if they have time, is the treasurer has been working on a plan. And Jill, if I don't have this right, please correct me. where if we could get a $10 million allocation to start school construction aid, the potential would be to capitalize nearly $500 million or potentially $500 million through a mechanism that would not have school construction aid debt service paid up front, but would pay a portion of the annualized costs over the entirety of a bond. So it's a way to provide an infusion of money against the debt service rather than reduce the front end debt service with a state grant for school construction. I'm going to stop there with these final words, and then Jill can correct anything I didn't have right. On the advocacy front, I think there's two things to do, one short term, one longer term. In the short term, you should talk with your legislators about the capital construction needs and facility needs in your school systems and urge them to support not only H871, but any state policy that is proposed in the foreseeable future that will continue to keep momentum on this school facilities focus. That's the first thing. And the second thing is, to the extent that you are not already doing it, and I would imagine that you all are because you're on this webinar, you ought to have school facilities, capital planning needs, and the future of your buildings a regular part of your school board meetings. So that's the broad message that I wanted to share, and I hope that I had most or all of it correct.
So Jill's giving you a thumbs up, so I think you got it. You nailed it. Thank you. Thanks, Jeff, so much for that. I'm going to pass it over to Marty next, and also let the viewers know that we will have questions and answers right after Marty finishes up his presentation. So Marty, take it away.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me here today. I'll give you a little bit of background about myself. I worked in the K through 12 public school sector for about 25 years. I started as a food service director at Harwood when I was 23. I worked there for about 9 years, and then I got a job at Lamoille where I oversaw food service facilities and transportation. While I was at Lamoille, I oversaw a couple major building projects, one of which was with the Green Mountain Technology and Career Center. And I think we were the last school to receive construction aid before the moratorium. I was at Lamoille for about 9 years, and then I went to Burlington, where I was there for about 7 years. I oversaw dozens of building projects, up to including what was called the re-envisioning for project, which was the renovation for the high school that, as most of you probably know, was terminated because of the findings of PCBs. And through that process, I was working with a project manager. His name was Tom Peterson, who owned PCI Consulting. And at the time that we terminated that project, Tom decided to sell his company, of which I purchased 2 years ago with one of his existing employees who worked for him. So we're about a six employee firm located in our main offices in Burlington, and I have a satellite office here in the VSA building. Actually, I'm right across the hall from Jeff. So we have about 5 project managers that work for us, and we oversee construction projects ranging from working with healthcare, municipalities, some low-income housing, and I specialize with schools because of obviously my background. So we're working with dozens of school districts across the state, one of which is still Burlington School District, and I'm currently overseeing that current new building project with Burlington as well. So what is a school facilities project and how do you start one? So the first step is to develop a district-wide facilities condition assessment. Luckily, as Bob mentioned, that process started with BVTA. We played a small role in that process, actually. We partnered with BVTA. Mostly what we did was, gather the utility information from each of the schools and we did some of the takeoffs of the buildings and whatnot, but again, we did play a small role in that process. So we're very familiar with how that process rolled out. So once you have a facilities condition assessment, you can then create a master plan. And when doing this, putting together this master plan, you should be looking at your district as a whole and not focusing on, one individual school. Go ahead, Debbie. So here's an example of a summary of a facilities condition assessment that was done with Burlington School District when I was the facilities director at Burlington. We worked with actually the same company, BBTA, to do this facilities condition assessment about 6-7 years ago. At the time, the company's name was EMG, but it is the same company. So by doing a district-wide facilities condition assessment, we were able to develop a 10-year master plan identifying which schools would be prioritized to receive major renovations and which ones we would conduct minor capital improvements over time. That also allowed us to build a capital budget to support the planned projects. Some of those projects obviously required us to go out to bond for a bond vote. Go ahead, Debbie. So what are the benefits of using an OPM, Owner's Project Manager? We know that school administrators and staff are already stretched thin. Not to mention their primary responsibility is to oversee and manage the day-to-day operations. Sometimes when you take on these projects, you're expected to work with contractors and architects anywhere from 15-20 hours a week. That's a significant burden on existing staff to oversee these projects that sometimes take anywhere from 2 to 5 years to oversee. So an OPM can help shed some of that burden off of school resources to manage these complex and time-consuming initiatives for the district. Go ahead, Debbie. Go ahead. So it's important to understand what that project schedule looks like up front. Most people are not aware how long it could take to do the design work for these projects. It typically takes an architect anywhere from 18 to 24 months to do the level of design that goes into a major renovation of a school. It's, as I said, important to know that as you start these projects. And then the construction itself can take anywhere from 2 to 24 months. So it's not uncommon for these projects to take 4 to 5 years from start to completion. And sometimes there's things along the way that that impact the project schedule, certain findings that you may have. So it's important to plan around those obstacles as well. Go ahead, Debbie. So what is the level of design that usually needs to happen before going to bond? Most school districts are notorious for just going through what's called a concept design and coming up with a very, very high level cost per square foot to before going to bond. The reason why school districts do this is because there's a lot of money that needs to go into that design work, that if you make that investment into the design and ultimately you go to bond and the bond fails, so you've kind of wasted those funds by putting that level of design into the process up front. But the risk is if you don't put that level of design in the front end, then the school district is often at risk to coming up with surprises through the design process. I'll give you an example of Burlington School District. The big surprise that they found were PCBs in the building. Once they found those PCBs in the building, that was totally impacting the total project cost up to including the final decision of terminating that project. So there's lots of things that can be developed during the schematic design process that if you're able to do those upfront investigation before you go to bond, it's better to be able to know those known costs before you have a fixed budget that you need to work with after going to bond. So what is an owner's project manager's role? So typically, we're part of the projects from the planning stage through the design stage, through the construction stage, and oftentimes right into the move-in stage, which usually requires also the FF&E process, which is furniture, fixture, and equipment. So typically when moving into a new building, the FF&E process is not part of the construction, but it is a really big process to consider how to fit up the building with new furniture, fixture, and equipment, which is something we can help our clients through as well. So an OPM works directly for the owner. Our primary goal is to protect the owner's best interest by keeping the project on schedule and on budget. Obviously, contractors are often protecting their own best interest, and that interest is sometimes their bottom line. Architects sometimes are heavily focused on building aesthetics and architectural details. We're ensuring that we're meeting our client's best interest, and obviously with my background, I'm making sure that the school facilities are being designed in a way to meet the focus and the goals of the school. Go ahead, Debbie. So we can also assist in determine what is the best construction delivery method. Folks may not know, but there's a couple of different construction delivery methods. The most common is general contractor. When using a general contractor, you need to finalize all of those design documents before you go to bid. So that means if that takes the 12 to 18 month process to finalize those designs, you can't get a contractor on board until those designs are complete, and then you go out to bid for that contractor. When using a construction manager, you're oftentimes bringing the construction manager on during the design process, and instead of going out to bid for the overall project, you're going out to bid for what's called a CM fee. So they're typically being compensated for a percentage of the overall project, and then they're going out to bid to all the subs on your behalf. So there are two different processes there. There's pros and cons depending on the project, on which delivery method to use, but we can help schools determine that best method for your project. Go ahead, Debbie. When's the best time to bring on an OPM? As I mentioned, right in the planning stages, we can lead the development of the district-wide master plan. We can also lead the procurement process when bringing on, the architect team and/or contractors. Go ahead, Debbie. So school districts are subject to Title 16, which is a school public bid law. So they have to follow certain procurement requirements when hiring a contractor. And when those construction projects are over 500,000, which, as you can imagine, most construction projects are, you have to go through what's called a pre-qualification of the contractor process. That process also has timelines associated to it. So if you're not following those timelines and those procedures to a T, you could be subject to contractors challenging that process. And when pre-qual, also, if you don't get at least 2 bids, then you have to reach out to AOE for a bid waiver. And when you reach out to AOE for that bid waiver, you need to provide all the documentation that you went through for that procurement process. And they're reviewing that to make sure you're meeting the letter of the public bid law. When pre-qualifying contractors, you're also required to award the contract to the low bidder. So that's why it's important to go through a thorough pre-qualification process to vet the contractors that are able to bid on the project in advance of actually receiving those bids, so that you're not bound to go with someone who does not have the qualifications to oversee your project just because of the low bidder. Thank you, Debbie. So what's the school board's role in that process? Well, obviously, the school boards typically approve the budget. the school board is required to approve the contractor pre-qualification criteria. Here's like a few examples of that criteria. So typically we're putting out what's called a request for qualifications. It lists what these contractor pre-qualification criteria are. Some of those examples are, you know, having successfully completed a construction project of similar size and cost. I mean, if you have a $50 million project, you want to make sure that contractor's done projects that are $50 million. If it's a building 300,000 square feet, you want to make sure that they've done projects of similar size. Having completed a project, an actual school construction project. You don't want contractors that have never worked in a school before. There's lots of little details that you need to focus on when working in a fully occupied school that we want to make sure that they have experience with. The other, so once you pre-qualify those contractors, let's just say that I'm working with a team that are kind of reviewing those qualifications. Sometimes that includes interviewing the contractors, following up with references, reviewing, you know, all of their qualification materials. We would then bring that recommendation to the board, and that the final approval of who is eligible to bid on a project is a board required action. And then once you actually go out to bid to those pre-qualified contractors, the final bids would then have to be approved by the school board as well. Go ahead, Debbie. So additional roles for school board members, as Jeff mentioned as well, you know, supporting the development and funding of long-term capital budgets, help advocate the need for school renovations to your community, support your school administration to oversee necessary projects, and help sell any capital bond campaign, and advocate for your schools, state school construction aid to your local state representative. Thank you.
Thanks, Marty. We have just a few minutes for questions. Carrie, what do we have going on in the Q&A box? And just so you know, if we don't get to everybody's questions, what we do is we capture your questions and we'll email responses to those questions we don't get to today. So don't be alarmed if we don't get to your question. We will be sure to get your response. So Carrie, what do you see in the Q&A box?
Okay, the first question says, with regards to the legislation in progress, will there be a process to include or support districts that are already engaged in school construction planning? We have engaged in significant community engagement, board planning, and contracted work with architects, but have likely not met all the precondition terms listed. Obviously, we didn't know what those conditions were when we started this work 2 years ago.
I can provide a response, and Jeff, please feel free to jump in. So I think that is one of the, okay. So I think there's sort of two sets of questions here potentially. The question has certainly come up, and I think it's a very fair one to ask, is what about, say, school boards and districts that have moved forward with construction and, you know, got the bond vote passed and did the project? That is a question for the working group. It's one of the identified questions for the working group. To what extent may those projects be grandfathered in? You know, that is a to be determined. The other question around, you know, our community has done a lot of engagement work. So in terms of H871, that contains this master planning grant opportunity. There and the school construction task force report and the working group do have a set of eligibility criteria. One thing I would say that there was fairly strong agreement on, and Jeff, please feel free to jump in, was there was some strong agreement that before a project would become eligible, and I want to signal these are questions to be answered. No one should take anything in the task force report or H 871, as these are determinations that have been made. These documents are roadmaps for what are the major questions to be asked and answered. So I just want to ensure that no one's feeling anxious about that, right? Because those decisions haven't been made. But there was some strong consensus around the idea that before a state construction aid eligible project in a school, might receive state construction aid funding, that we would want to see something like a district level master plan. So something like what Marty was pointing to, where as a district, right? So not just the school and not just say the school board, but like that SUSD level, that the district has come together and had conversations about what is our future state of our school buildings, and how are we going to think about things like enrollment trends? What is the education programming that we want to deliver? And then an analysis of the condition of the facilities and which are the most appropriate places to invest. So that did have a strong consensus that there is a recognition, and I think maybe this touches some other questions, so I'm just going to sort of say it, Carrie, and I might be, killing a few birds here. There was a recognition on the part of the construction task force, and I think that you've seen this in the conversations happening in the State House as well, that given I'm going to call it the hole that we are in, what the facilities assessment has really revealed to us, which I don't think was a surprise for a lot of folks. We, as a small state with limited and competing demands on our resources, are never going to be able to fill that hole with state dollars, right? And so in that environment of some limitations and some boundaries on how much funding will be available, how will funds be prioritized? And so that's where the kind of master planning and engagement as an eligibility criteria comes in, is that the state, this doesn't say anything about local decisions, the state is likely going to invest in specific priorities that are driving towards determined education and strategic outcomes that we're looking for. The state is writ large there. So that includes a lot of input from folks. And in the task force report, again, these are not predetermined, these are questions to be asked, but the task force report was really framed around this idea of, well, we have some legislation that is telling us what the state priorities are. There's a question there, could that be used as the framework that drives these state dollars and state priorities? I'm hoping I addressed a bunch of questions in there. Jeff, please feel free to jump in.
No, I thought you covered it. I don't have anything to add. Thank you.
Right, well, we are running short on time, so I'm gonna read two other questions. And then as Debbie said before, we will answer all questions in the follow-up email. It's just that given the time frame. So the next question says, the state pre-approves contractors for grant awarded projects on the municipal level. Would this be available for school construction projects?
I can help on that one as well. We are really interested in that. When we're looking at some other states, like Rhode Island, they use that model. We've been in touch with Buildings and General Services. That is something that's on the task list for the working group as well.
Great, and you may have answered this, I'm not sure. This next question is, what are the proposed sources to fund the proposed grant program?
That is a question for House Appropriations, I would say. And I don't think anybody here can answer it.
Another TBD.
Yeah.
All right.
What I would just, if I can just add, we don't know the source of funds, but we do know whatever sources of funds are derived, the effort is to leverage it to the greatest maximum investment into school facilities. And that's where the creativity in the treasurer's office comes in.
Thanks, Jeff. Well, then I just want to say thank you so much to our panelists today. Thank you, Marty, Jill, Bob and Jeff, for all of sharing your expertise and insight into what's been happening. As I said, I think this report, just the timing of its release was unfortunate. I really am glad that we had this chance to kind of refocus, reshine the light, if you will, on this report and its findings, and to get a sneak peek into the dashboard, I thought was amazing. That was really great, Bob. So we look forward to seeing it when it goes live, and definitely we'll talk to the AOE about ways that VSBA can help coach school boards on how to use the dashboard. Maybe we'll do another webinar or something like that. So thank you all very much for attending today. Please do take 2 minutes to do the 3-question survey at the end of this webinar. When you log off, you'll see it pops right up. Don't close it down. Please give us some feedback. This is the only way we can improve the webinars and serve you all better as members. Thank you again for coming, and everybody have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, Marty. Carrie, don't close out your box because I want to make sure we get the questions.